My name is Stafford Scott. I'm one of the co-curators of the exhibition called Warring of Babylon, that we're honoured that the ICA is hosting here. Can just get a bit of interactivity. Can I ask if who's seen the exhibition thus far? Excellent, that's brilliant. I'd ask that the rest of you actually go and see the exhibition, because fundamentally this is a significant part of the public programme, and it's reflected in the exhibition above, the exhibition outside. But before I get ahead of myself, I want to first of all introduce my organisation, introduce myself. I am Stafford Scott. I'm the coordinator of an organisation we call Tottenham Rights. It's a community interest company. Tottenham Rights comes out of, again, our experience and our history is reflected in the exhibition outside. We come from the Broadwater Farm Defence Campaign that was established in the 1980s following the uprisings on Broadwater Farm and the police vendetta campaign, where they arrested and charged numbers of people and they framed them and fitted them up for crimes that they hadn't committed. And we created a defence campaign to obviously campaign, challenge the system, hold the state to account, and ultimately to free and vindicate those who had been framed and fitted up for the murder of a policeman that they obviously didn't commit. We're part of the Tottenham Defence Campaign. We come from the Tottenham Defence Campaign that was set up in 2011 following the incidents that we're going to talk about today, following the police killing of Mark Duggan in Tottenham, the disrespect to their family, the demonstration that took place outside the police station, and then the uprising, the disturbance, the riot, whatever people call it, the insurgents, the public disorder that then took place outside the Tottenham police station. We established a defence campaign to defend those who were there. Our defence campaigns are based on the principles that self-defence is no offence. And we're a community that's constantly under attack. And if you look at the exhibition outside, you'll see that. So that's my introduction to Tottenham Rights. We're a community interest company, and our interest is fighting for racial equality and fighting against racial injustice. We believe that that struggle is paramount to all struggles for racial equality, because if you don't have justice, you're not going to get nothing. People say that if you have economic wealth, you can buy justice. But trust me, we talk about the Black Wall Street in America. They had economic wealth. They bombed it out. They took it out because they didn't have a system where they could get justice. So we're all about fighting for justice. In terms of an introduction to the exhibition that you see outside, by way of introduction, I have to say that we created a partnership that we're going to talk about here today with Forensic Architecture. They have a relationship with the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and we were given what we believe is, well, we hope isn't a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but for me it probably is. I've been campaigning for 40-odd years now, and this is the first I've been in a space like this. This is the first, and many of you would have probably heard my voice. This is the first that you would have seen what we're showing out there in our exhibition. So maybe it is once in a lifetime. I hope it isn't. But what I want to do is acknowledge the team that helped to put together that exhibition. Kamara Scott, somewhere in the place, too dark for us to see. Rianna Jade Parker, I'm not sure she's here. No? And our designer, Abby Wright. I want to acknowledge and pay homage to their curatorial skills, because I'm not a curator, but I have experienced much of what we see in that exhibition out there. And to be clear what that exhibition's about, we call it War in a Babylon, because Babylon is a system that refuses to give justice. Babylon's a system where the few control the many. Babylon's a system based on capitalism, where some people in the community have to always be oppressed. Babylon's a system that was actually built on the struggles, the blood, sweat, and tears of others. And Babylon's a system that denies its existence and denies its oppressive nature. So we call this War in a Babylon. And some of you would have heard of late that in the Home Office, they created this thing called the hostile environment not too long ago, yeah? Yeah? You did hear about it, yeah? You was paying it. I was going to say you was paying attention, yeah? All right. But for us, what this exhibition says is the hostile environment was here from the day we stepped off of the Windrush, literally. There's just times and terms when they ratchet it up a bit more than other times and terms. Generally, those times are when the Tories are in government. It gets ratcheted up. And this at the current moment is one such time. So we're here trying to enlist people in an army to fight in our war against the Babylon, against this society, against this system. We're trying to find right-minded, like-minded people that we can engage with. I've had the media who think that they have the right to keep on setting the agendas for communities. I've had them keep on telling me, Staff, we want you on an estate in Tottenham, because I'm linked to an estate in Tottenham. It's called Broadwell Farm. I'm linked to uprisings there. I was arrested for the murder of a police officer there and accused by the police of being one of the ringleaders of that uprising. And the media keep on perpetually wanting to show this imagery, but that's the very imagery that keeps the police wanting to come into our community and punish us, because it's the imagery that goes back to the days when we gave the police a bloody good hiding. And this is all told out there. It's told our history about how we arrived in this country, the deprivation our parents were forced to live in, the deprivation we lived in, the way that the police went into went into the history books, went into the annals of history and took out ancient law, used common law and used it against us to criminalize and penalize us and to stop us from being able to move freely throughout this country. It's a history out there that the media doesn't tell you about and doesn't share with you, so then you don't understand the behaviors that you might see today. And without that explanation, when you see certain behaviors, you might think that we are today what they said we were back in the day, somehow less than human. So this is our story out there. We tell the story of our response to that treatment. We became ragamuffin. I was ragamuffin. I still am ragamuffin. Ragamuffin was a mindset that said we wasn't going to take what our parents took before. Ragamuffin was a mindset that said we was going to stand our ground. Our parents lived in this country and they got abused, but they took the abuse thinking that because they were economic migrants, they were going to be able to go one day. So they took that abuse. I was born in this country and didn't have anywhere to go to. So I wasn't going to take the abuse. When the abuse came, I had to let people know, especially when they used to tell me, F off back to where you come from. I had to let people know, actually, this is where I come from. And if you don't accept me, then we're going to have to fight for this space, because I got nowhere to go and I'm not going nowhere. That's ragamuffin, and that's reflected out there. It's a period in time that is not written about in the history books, because Raga didn't really write. But it's in our music. We're going to show a play here when we do the rest of the public program that reflects the experiences of ragamuffin. But this is a history that happened in this country that you'll never see in any history book. You'll never learn about in any lecture in university. So we think that not only is this historic event, we think it's kind of historical. We try in that exhibition to use a wide lens to show you the experience of the black community since the Windrush generation came to this country. And then we use a narrower lens to take you into a specific experience of the community that I was born and grew up in. That would be the community of Tottenham. We seem to be a really special community. As a matter of fact, we were identified as being a special community by Kenneth Newman. You see, we start the exhibition with a paragraph, a comment by him. He called us a symbolic location. So a symbolic location for policing. This is when we was on the Broadwell Farm estate, which was a symbolic location for the black community of Tottenham. He said it was a symbolic location for policing, and we didn't know what he meant until we woke up the next morning and recognized that what he meant was we were now going to be over-policed and under-protected. So that story is told out there, how, again, we created front lines to keep out racists, and that put us in direct conflict with the police, and where the front lines were created, the uprisings happened. That story is told in the exhibition, and then we tell the story of Broadwater Farm, where they said the most violent rioting, they called it, but we called it an uprising, took place on mainland England, where a police officer lost their life, but it only happened because a black woman lost her life before, and they generally don't tell you that in the history. So we tell you about that history, and then we show you that not only did we give them a bloody good hiding on the estate on that day, which is in the history book, but we gave them a bloody good hiding in the courts. The investigation they had went down in the annals of their history as the biggest cock-up in the history of British policing, and because of that, they're still punishing our community today. It's our history. I do walkabouts out there on a Thursday and a Saturday, and if people come, I will give you the detail of that history. When we go in that space, we always also talk about the corruption. This is the case when they arrest the Tottenham Six and convict the Tottenham Three, where we see levels of corruption, the likes of which we've never seen before. And we tell our story out there because it's a story that's never told in the British media. It's a story that happens in front of everybody's eyes, but it's a story that remains untold. And then we look at deaths in custody, because that's unique and special. Well, it's not unique to our community. What's unique is we have lost the most people in our community than in any single community. And nearly all of those people that we lost happen to be black. So in Tottenham, when we were designing this, Tottenham, which is in the borough of Haringey, when we were designing this program, we'd lost 5 families. 5 victims. We had 5 families that we support, 5 families who live in our community, 5 families whose trauma is part of our trauma, whose trauma we feel. As we finish this, another person, at least one more person has died in the London Borough of Haringey that we're aware of, but the IOPC, the Independent Office for Police Complaints, now has a new game where they don't put out their name, so we're not sure the identity of that victim, but we already know that he's definitely a person of colour. So we've lost the most, and all of them happen to be black. And no one's asking the question of how this can be possible. If you lost, and Tottenham's not all black by any means. If you lost people of different races, you could say, well, maybe, there's a few accidents going on there, a bit of malpractice. But if you're only losing people of one culture and one race, you've got to ask what the hell is going on. So we look at deaths in custody. We have what we call a gallery of broken lives, where we show the photographs, the broken frames. All of those people happen to have died in police custody. And when I do the walkthrough, I always stop in the middle of the gallery of broken lives to show people smiley culture. Have you all seen that picture of Smiley? Have you seen those pictures out there, those water paintings? Yeah? Have you seen the picture of smiley culture? Do you know who smiley culture was? All right. Do you know how he came to meet his end? Okay, for those who don't, right? He died whilst the police were raiding his home. Smiley was a celebrity. Okay? Celebrity. He had a bit of money. He was accused of being involved in drug importation. He was actually on bail, accused of being involved in a big-scale drug importation. There was rumours going around at the time. Because we're on cameras, I'm not going to say what those rumours were because, you know, they were rumours. But what we know is the police went to his home, and he lived outside of London. He lived in a big detached home. He was moneyed, so he lived well. They went to his home. Now, I don't know if last year, if you all saw police officers when they stop young black kids and they want to do stop and search. If you saw on the social media the way that they generally tend to manacle them, handcuff them, put them on the ground or rough them up before they even tell them why they're stopping them. Because that's our norm. The police want us to believe that they went on the drugs bus to Smiley Culture's house, someone who's already on bail for having brought in significant amounts of Class A drugs, and that they didn't handcuff him, that they allowed him to walk around whilst they were performing the raid or the search, and that he went into the kitchen and that he took a knife, and he took that knife and he plunged that knife in his own heart. I always had to stop at that spot because I find that one of the most, I've been around campaigning for, well, Cynthia Jarrett died, God, 37 something years ago. I've been campaigning around deaths in custody and family justice campaigns since then. And I've never heard of anyone who plunged a knife in their heart to kill themselves. And I defy you to do any research and find people who plunge knives in their heart to kill themselves. When I did say that, one person said to me, well, you're Japanese committing harikari. You know, I think that that's kind of gone out of fashion even in Japan. So for me, right, that's unheard of and outrageous, right? Not just that no one will plunge a knife in their heart, but that the police would allow somebody to be walking around and go into a kitchen and be able to get an offensive weapon. That's unheard of. That's outrageous that they want people to believe that this happened. So, you'd have thought that after he plunged a knife in his heart, let's play their game, right? Let's follow the logic. After he plunged a knife in his heart, you'd have thought that they're going to find a ton of cocaine in the fridge, right? Because they're going to have to find something that puts him in a materially worse position now than he was when they came there, right? But they don't find anything. And when the trial of his co-defendants happens at court, they all get off. So can see no reason why he would take a knife and plunge it in his heart, because it's not as if he's going to go to prison, because they found nothing. At the inquest into the police killing the Smiley Culture, the police were asked, didn't you handcuff him? And they said, no, it's Smiley, why would we handcuff him? Everybody knows he is, he's not going to run away, why would we handcuff him? We even let him go in the kitchen to get the coffee. So what's these bruises on his wrist? Sam. Yeah, we did handcuff him. But we handcuffed him after he stabbed himself in the heart to ensure that he didn't take the knife from out of his heart and then stab one of us. No, you can laugh. You can laugh. You can laugh. What you can't do is disprove it. What you can't do is disprove it. Because the police have a monopoly on investigating crime, especially crimes that police commit. And even when you catch them in the most outrageous of lies, what they do is they say, prove us wrong then. Go on. And you can't. And this is our experience, and this is our life, and this is happening to us. I mean, Smiley was when was Smiley, man? It wasn't that long ago. In the days of social media, you know, books were being written, newspapers were being written. It wasn't that long ago. This is our real lived experience. So that's what we try and tell people about in the lower floor of our exhibition here. And then in the upper floor, we try to let people understand. We've got a room up there, it's called the SAD room, state-assisted deaths, state-aided deaths, whatever we want to call it. They killed them. And in Tottenham, in Haringey, we got 5. 5 people. I know 4 of them personally. 5 families. So we've got 5 plimps up there because we're trying to pay homage to them in the way that the media never does. Trying to humanize them. Tell us about your family member, who they were when they're alive with you. And if you watch and pay attention, what you'll see is those whose family member has died 20 odd or 30 years ago, they're able to tell a story They might even smile. They actually, they can remember the loved one. Those who's died only 10 years ago, they can't tell no story. They can't get past the day the loved one was killed. So in Tottenham, we live with these families, shattered lives, shattered families. It shatters families. You see families, we support families on campaigns. I support them because it fractures them. Sometimes there's blame, sometimes there's guilt. Sometimes they get an inquest result and our families, and it takes 5 years, 4 years to get the inquest, so it's tiring. And sometimes some family members say, well, that's enough. And other family members say, well, no, it's not. And they carry on fighting and it causes rifts. You'll be amazed. So people like me, we try to support these families in these hours of need. And upstairs, we try to honor them. So please, do listen to those families. There's 5 up there. Like I said, there should be 6. But what we want people to understand about the 5 is this. The 5th one, the last one to die, Jermaine Baker, shot in December 2015. Who knows the name Jermaine Baker, please? Okay. Be careful, because I might ask you questions about it. You know? Make sure that if you put up your hand, you know. The reason the whole entire hall doesn't know the name is really kind of perverse and sick and twisted. You don't know his name because we didn't burn down Tottenham. They're not going to build statues for him like that stuff we see out there. You don't know his name because we didn't burn down the place. Again, when you're in that room, that sad room, what I want people to do is look at Mark Duggan's name. We've got names up on the wall, those who have died. It's not an exhaustive list. Those who have died in police custody, those that we're aware of. And what I want you to do is look at Mark Duggan's name and then see how many have died since then. Especially all the woke people who have been awoke since George Floyd, right? See how many died before you awoke. You'd be surprised. It's shocking that this happens and it keeps on happening. And it does it because the police have a monopoly on investigating the police when the police are involved in crimes like this. So we look at Duggan upstairs. Sorry, we look at the 5 families. And this is what we really want to say about the 5 families. So Jermaine Baker, the name that most people don't know, the public inquiry, and we should know his name because the public inquiry into his killing is going on right now. It's been going on for about a month and it's ongoing. So we should know his name, but that tells us that the media's not telling us anything about Jermaine Baker. And the irony about Jermaine Baker is he died in suspiciously similar circumstances to Mark Duggan. The difference with him is that, just like Duggan, they made sure they didn't have the cameras, even though they should have the cameras by now, but what they did have, the car was bugged. So just like Duggan, but unlike Duggan, we can prove it's there, formally shows that he didn't have a gun in his hand when shot and that the police knew it. But the media's not telling us about this, okay? We don't have time in this session to go into collusion between media and press, media and the police, but media, police, and judiciary. Then we go to talk about media, police. Oh, God, we got to talk about collusion with everybody. So anyway, that in public inquiry is going on right now. So there's 4 plinths, 4 other families. And what we really want people to know and understand about our experience in Tottenham is only one of those families, only one of those people who got killed had an inquest jury return a verdict of lawful killing. I'll say it again, because I didn't say that right. 4 victims, and only 1, the last, well, up until Jermaine. Mark Duggan in 2011 did the jury come back with a finding of lawful killing. So that means the others, there was no finding of lawful killing, and this is a community that remembers. So when they killed Duggan, we're all going to pay attention. When they start to disrespect the parents and not go to the house to tell them that they've killed their child, we're all going to pay attention because we have a history. This didn't happen in isolation. This is a part of our history, and that's what this exhibition's about today. The exhibition's about to show that what happened to Mark didn't happen in isolation. It's part of our history. It's what we've grown up with, and it's what we've always faced. for the reasons that I've given you. So what we do upstairs then, with the help of our comrades, forensic architecture, is we explore what lawful killing really means. So if this is the only lawful killing that we've ever had, let's have a look at this phenomenon. Let's really examine and see what this guy did that justified him being executed. Because when you watch a forensic architecture Mark Duggan model, it's hard to come up with any other understanding other than he was executed on that space. So the other day, and now that was the ground I'm confident on. Now I've got to use some technology, and it's a bit different to what I'm used to, so you're going to have to bear with me. The other day, yesterday, we opened up our public program to the exhibition. The exhibition has been running for 1 month now. People have come in here, they really love it. People are coming back. There's a heck of a lot of information out there. And because for many people it's really relatively new, they have to come back. And yesterday we opened up by showing Gillian Slovo, the playwright. We showed her film version of the play, The Riots. So we showed what happened post the police shooting of Mark Duggan. Now I'm going to quickly go through, because what I needed to do before we bring on forensic architecture is really kind of bring people up to date with all that has happened and really set the ground and set a platform for forensic architecture to come and really examine and show you the results of their forensic examination. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands what we saw in the Duggan inquest. And just like I just said to you, Jermaine Baker public inquiry is going on right now, and the media's not covering it. Same way with the Duggan. Even though this was this is the spark that lit all that nights of insurrection that went on across England, what they do, and what we're talking about here is the system at all times, Babylon. The inquest system is our Babylon system. People who are not used to it might think that, here we go, people have, the families, the victims have a chance for people to find out what truly happened. That's a joke. It doesn't work like that at all. There's no parity of arms. The inquest system, I couldn't believe it in the Duggan. I mean, we had one QC and one junior, and they had about 10. They had about 10 QCs. The police officer has a QC, the police fed has a QC, the shooter has a QC, the home officer has a QC, everybody. Oh God, everybody help me out here. The governors was all those, the governors, the top coppers, they have their QCs, everybody has a QCs. There's about 10 QCs in there, and these QCs, all they ever do is go to these inquests and protect these lying buggers. So there's no parity of arms in the inquest system at all. And we had a different kind of inquest because it was judge-led, because the police had been listening to Duggan from the clouds. And there's laws, the Reaper laws. And once the Reaper laws kicks in, certain people are not allowed to know anything. Even the IPCC, once the Reaper laws kicked in, and that was the old Independent Police Complaints Commission, they can't tell you that the Reaper laws are kicked in. They've just told you that something's happened that means that they can't carry out certain actions. So we had a judge, Judge Keith Cutler. And Judge Keith Cutler was at pains at the beginning because of the disturbances that happened. He was at pains to come and meet the family, to let them rest assured that he was going to try to have the most rigorous process he could possibly have. He was a good man. He was a gentleman. By the time we got to the inquest, though, he wasn't as warm to the family by the time the inquest opened. One thing I need to get to before I get to the inquest, right, I'm not going to go back over the uprising in Tottenham. other than to say that I was accredited as being one of the people who led the demonstration there, that when we initially went there, went with about 40 or 50 people, mainly women, women with children. Had the police been receptive? Well, had the police actually gone to the Duggan's house, as was their responsibility and their job to do, we wouldn't have gone to the police station that day. Had they been receptive, we sent messages that we was coming, we wouldn't have gone to the police station that day. Had they treated people with respect at the police station, what happened would never have happened. When we got there, we actually agreed that only women should go in because we didn't want it to appear to be threatening. Also, we didn't have a lot of muscle outside anyway, so we didn't want them to get threatened and come and rush us because we'd get stomped. And the women went in, and the police officers just said to them immediately, "We can't talk to you, this is under investigation by the IPCC," and they walked them out. Literally walked them out. And then when they walked them out, they came out and then they rolled down the shutters as if they were telling us, business is done for the day, the station's closed. And that really sent bad vibes through the crowd, and we was forced away for a long time, and nobody came to see, nobody responded, and the frustration and the anger took over, and those uprisings happened. If you're here later on at 8 o'clock, we're showing The Hard Stop. It's a documentary of the guy, the brother from our community who allegedly was the person who started the riots in Tottenham and therefore started the riots all over the country. His story will be told, so the story will be told then. So I don't want to necessarily talk, I want to talk about what happened afterwards. I want to set the ground for forensic architecture, so I need to show you some of the more perverse things that happened in this case. Another thing that happened on August the 6th when the kids, or the youth, man them, went to the police station, and women them, went to the police station was, whilst they were there, they started to hear this rumour that there'd been the shootout and that Duggan had fired the first shot. And what they were clear about was that he wasn't mad enough or bad enough to have done that. So not only did we go to the police station, when they were getting called and being told that the police were disrespecting people, they came to the police station really angry. There's two things about the police station. On the 9th of August, the IPCC finally confirmed what they knew from the off. They confirmed on the 9th of August that Duggan had not shot at a police officer. But they knew it from the off, because what we found out in the inquest later was no police officer ever alleged that Duggan had shot. So somehow the IPCC, this body that's allegedly independent, made up and puts out erroneous and false information that inflames the community. Because where before we was a bit suspicious, now we know they're talking crap. Now we know something's wrong. But they don't explain this until after Tottenham was burnt. In many ways, we feel that we were set up in this community because what they did, these treatments, should never be happening in anywhere, much less a town that has a history like Tottenham. So it's hard to believe sometimes that we're not being set up. So we had an inquest, and we lost the inquest. And they keep on telling us, "Oh, you lost the inquest, just shut up, you lost the inquest." But people weren't there, people don't understand. We didn't lose no inquest. This was some modern-day kangaroo court. This was crazy. We say that the judgment was perverse, and we don't say this because we're bitter losers. We say this because we're actually expert in inquest. We've been to more inquests than any community in town. We hold this experience. It's our history and it's in our memory. But we're not the only people who are saying that this judgment was perverse. But again, the media chooses not to tell you. Someone more important than me, someone less biased than me, I'm biased, I'll admit it. It's not even that I'm biased, I'm not biased at all. I'm cynical because of my experiences. But someone far less cynical than me has similar views. Now, I'm going to go through this presentation. There's 33 slides there, and you just heard how long I've just spoken for you, haven't you? That's death by slides, but I'm not going to go through all the slides, all right? I'm not going to go through all the slides, but it's just to show you, because what I've done is interrogated Judge Keith Cutler's. He did a report after the verdict. It's called a Schedule 5 report. He didn't have to do this report. This report is to prevent such deaths happening in future. He didn't have to do this report, okay? So troubled was he and so worried was he by what took place in his courtroom. He can't, the British judicial system says you mustn't disrespect the jury verdicts. You have to respect the jury verdicts. He's respecting the jury verdict, but he's also salving his conscience here. He's saying here, not me, Gov, right? He tried to get them to do the right thing. He did. I told you Jermaine Baker's having a public inquiry. It's because his legal team has seen what's happened here and they're not going down this route. The judge saw it in this case. When we started the inquest, we lost that judge. He wasn't the same guy who came to see the family. He was cold. He was officious. And it was because he had heard some secret recordings that nobody else could hear. He'd heard that Mark was up to no good. There was no disputing. His family at first didn't want to believe it because it's not really Mark, but it's clear he was. And the judge had heard and he knew it. And we knew, well, I knew from his reading him. But as the case went on, the judge moved because in knowing certain things that couldn't be revealed in court, he knew when the police were lying. And he couldn't tell us that he knew when the police were lying because he'd heard secret evidence. But he moved and he moved and he moves, to so much so that at the end of the inquest, this is what he said to the jury. Right, now you guys go out. You've heard what the police said. You've seen what the video says. This is Witness B's video. You'll see it upstairs. They both contradict each other. We wouldn't be here for so long if it wasn't for the video. You go out and make up your mind what you believe. So we think he put the bullets in their gun for them to fire and get the right verdict. But they bottled it because there's a massive ask and a massive task. So that's why Jermaine Baker's family's gone to a public inquiry. And then the judge came back after this and he wrote this Schedule 5 report. And this is the stuff he says in this report. Let me see if I can do this. And I'm going to skip through loads of slides. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you 33 slides, but it might take me a little while. I might be a little bit clumsy, so bear with me. There you go, you see, clumsy. Okay, so again, when you go upstairs, one of the plinths you're going to see is the case of Roger Sylvester. He was killed in 1999. And Roger Sylvester, they took 5 years to have his inquest. It took 2 months for the jury to hear all the evidence, and it took 2 hours for the jury to come back with a finding of unlawful killing. That's the verdict that families want to hear in inquest, unlawful killing. Evidence and proof that police officers behaved outside of their legal remit and took the life of their loved one. They got that verdict. We were pleased because now we hope that the police officers are arrested, charged, and held to account for their behaviors. 2 months later, I was in court when a judge said, I think the jury was confused. The judge didn't question the jury to test their ability, their mental ability to see. Remember what I said before, the judges don't like to undermine jury decisions. I was genuine. But in this case, they did it so quickly, and they didn't question the jury to prove that the jury were confused. And not only did they overturn their decision, they changed the law. Well, we're not going to trust these buggers with this crap anymore. They changed the law. And they brought in this new thing called narrative verdicts. In some cases, they no longer allow the jury to consider unlawful killing as an option. So they changed the game, they changed the playing field as we're learning the skills. And it's part of our history in Tottenham that contributes to the legal system that we're now living in and fighting against. So in this case, they asked, did they do enough to gather and react to intelligence? So this is how they get the narrative. And the jury decided unanimously that more could have been done to gather intelligence. The Kevin Hutchinson Foster that's referred to there is the gun supplier. And we believe that the police didn't want to get intelligence on him because he may have been very helpful to them. Did Mark have the gun with him in the taxi immediately before the stop? They agreed unanimously that he did. Did he have the gun in his hand when he was shot? The majority was sure that he did not have the gun in his hand when he was shot. Now, I was in the Royal Courts of Justice when this verdict was coming. We had the upstairs and court 16 and court, I can't remember the court, 16 and 31 or something. Excuse me. And we were there in numbers because we'd had a deal. They didn't want us hanging out all the days whilst the jury was out, so they told us that they would tell us when the verdict was coming in. So we got the numbers there. We were there. The court was packed. When this verdict was coming through, people started to scream. I was saying that if he didn't have the gun in his hand, I was saying to everyone, don't worry, the next one's got to be good. Because if they're saying they had the gun and then he didn't have it in the gun in his hand, the next one has to be that he was unlawfully killed because he didn't have the gun in his hand. But somehow they agreed, a majority concluded and marked through the gun, even though no evidence whatsoever was given. None. Nobody, no police officer said it, no independent witness, nothing said that he threw the gun before. As a matter of fact, one of the police officers clearly said it was his job to keep an eye on the windows of the minicab that Mark was travelling in, and he couldn't have thrown the gun. But the jury decided that he threw the gun. But what it actually means, they disbelieved, what's this? They disbelieved the officer who said, I saw him with a gun in his hand, and I shot him twice. The officer said, V53, it was a freeze-frame moment. I saw him, gun in his hand. I could see the trigger. I could see the sock over the gun. I shot him once. He turned around, gun pointing towards me. I shot him again. But they don't believe him, but somehow they say he's acted lawfully. And we call that perverse. Because how is it possible that to shoot an unarmed man can be lawful? He is not presenting a clear and present threat. And let's not be clear, I'll say this to camera. I'm a community activist. I don't like gunmen. Gunman's anti-community. Prisons are made for gunmen. And then we can help to rehabilitate them and make them fit to come back and be part of our community. You'll be surprised who we rehabilitate in the hood. So this is the questions that were put to them. And then, and I'm going to try and speed up a bit for you. This now is the Judge Keith Cutler in his Schedule 5 report identifying some of his concerns. There's 33 slides of it. So that would indicate that he had quite some concerns, wouldn't it? Jude, you're a lawyer, yeah? Right? And there's no way a judge who could come up with so many concerns would have been able himself to have said that this was a lawful killing, because he ends up with too many questions. And this is his way of saying, not me, Gov, the jury did it. And we'll quickly show you this. So concern one, they could have done better in their planning, intelligence. I need my glass for it. Concern two, comprehensive accounts were not taken after the police had shot and killed a human being. They didn't question them. They let them they let them to come together. They allowed them to confer. They allowed them to talk to police federation. They actually brought, this is what we learned in the inquest, the one who shot Mark Duggan, right, went off, had his lunch, and then had a meeting with another police officer who'd previously shot and killed someone to prepare them in preparation for the meeting with the police federation. And all of this is done as part of routine. The reason why, when they kill someone in these situations, we have to wait 5 years for an inquest, is because they're building brick by brick the wall of silence. They're building brick by brick that wall of inevitability to ensure and stop people from being able to see and achieve justice. And this is the, remember, this is me, this is the judge, and this is all the things he's saying. Could do a masterclass on this. We've done it before. We broke this down in the community immediately after this happened. Concern free, that the IPCC had primacy at the scene but didn't have the resources to conduct the relevant. So this notion of independence is bullshit. They are supposed to manage the police at the scene, not the police officers who committed the, whatever it was, who did the shooting. Other police officers come, and the IPCC are supposed to manage them. In this particular case, the IPCC, instead of going directly to the crime scene, they went straight to Lehman Street Police Station and hung out with these police officers. So they're leaving other police officers at the crime scene to manage the crime scene. So when later on you look at the Mark Duggan model, know this, the IPCC are not there whilst all these officers are doing what we show those officers doing. And this is the key. This is the key. I was left with an impression of some uncertainty about precisely what was being investigated, on whose behalf, for what purpose, and by what means. Now, I don't know how many of you know anything about the law, but you've got common sense, right? Right. This is a court of law. Someone's lost their life. He's presided over a case for 3 months. I can't believe that this man's going to go to the grave with this, to be quite honest with you. And I believe there was a point when forensic architecture, in doing their model, they was talking to his representative in court, almost got him to a meeting, and then later on was told he had been banned and barred from attending that meeting. So this is what we're dealing with. This is the judge after the perverse verdict. And again, I think I could really leave it there. The scene of the fatal police shooting was not video recorded. He says, Eyal, you turn on the video, he talks about the technology that was used in the case of Eyal Rodney. He says that these motor vehicles were more modern than the Eyals, but in Eyal Rodney, they got some recordings. Here, we don't get the recordings. He talks about the fact that they turn on the video recording when they start to resuscitate a dead man. Make yourself look good, why don't you? He's dead, but we're going to show you, we did care. We were conducting our safeguarding responsibilities after we took him out, Gov. The planned operation to seize weapons was not pursued after the fatal shot was fired. So this is the one that the media doesn't tell you. The guy who was going to pass in the gun, the one that was spoken about before, whose name is Kevin Hutchinson Foster, the police found out 2 days before. Right? First of all, we found out they had used the gun to pistol whip someone in Dalston a month before. That pistol whipping was carried out in broad daylight, and the police had been given ample evidence to have arrested this guy, especially as he was living in a bail hostel. He was on parole from prison. They did everything not to arrest him. And that's not like our experience, especially when guns are involved. Then this unit finds out 2 days before Mark Duggan is shot that this guy has 3 guns, and Duggan's going to go and get 1 gun from him. So let's do the maths. The guy's got 3 guns. Duggan's got no gun. And their job, Operation Trident, their only job is to keep guns off the street. What would you do? Go and arrest who? The guy with 3 guns, right? Come on. They allow 1 gun to be transported, kill the man for 1 gun, and what the judge is saying, well, okay, so you kill the guy for 1 gun, and you know this other guy's still got the other 2 guns, right? But you didn't pursue it. I didn't, and as he says, I don't expect the guys who just took out Kevin, who took out Mark to go. I expect other police officers to go. But you don't go. Guess when they go? Guess how long it takes them to go? Remember what happens? A police officer shot, London burns, 4 days of uprising, rioting, looting in London, 5 days across the United Kingdom, and guess when they go for this guy who passed the gun? Because this is what caused it all, isn't it? 90 days later. Is that possible? Do you think he's got the 2 guns sitting down waiting for them? This is what's going on these streets. Well, not out here, not up here, uptown Oi Polloi, but this is what's going on in the hood. This is what's going on in front of everyone's eyes, in full view of everybody. The armed police operation was not recorded. So there's no photography, we have nothing. And this is why, they're in control of everything. Or so they think. They have a monopoly on investigating. They have a monopoly on conducting the operation. They made sure that Ferry Lane, there's cameras all over the place. They made sure that they took him out in a place where there was no cameras. And this is why we pay homage to our comrades called forensic architecture, because they can help us to see the things that were previously unseen. This is about the IPCC. They're defunct now. And basically, this is the case that made them state understand that they were a total irrelevance. So we won't even go into that one. Oh, this one is important. The IPC and counsel to an inquest do not have access to all the intelligence. How the hell can the IPCC or any independent body that's supposed to conduct investigations into the police conduct a thorough investigation if they don't have all access to the intelligence? How is that humanly possible? So he knows that they were being conned because he's had access to everything and he's seen the limitations within this system. And now I'm going to really try and set you up forensic architecture and tell you what he knows. One of the things he knows and one of the things we learn and one of the things you'll see is in this scenario, there's a guy called White T-shirt. I think it's RRQ63. White T-shirt. He's the bad guy. We see it, and we can know, and everyone's saying it's white T-shirt, it's white T-shirt. And at the inquest, we start to hear and see, and you'll see in the Duggan model white T-shirt. And this is what we learn at the end of the inquest. Right at the end of the inquest, there's some consternation going on. It's the IPCC. Oh, God, oh. Right at the end. And we say, well, what's going on? And they say, God, we've made another blunder here, you know that? Yet another blunder. Well, what have you done this time, poor IPCC? You know that guy in the white T-shirt? Yeah. Well, he's R63. And you know that guy, he's being flagged. Flagged by who, IPCC? By us. Flagged by you for what? Well, we flagged him because we caught him in a scenario, right, where he was investigated by the police. It was an incident where he shot a black man. And we, for some reason, allowed the police to investigate the police, and they exonerated him. But we found evidence that showed that he had lied. Oh, God, I wish I could remember that term. And when we went back to the police said, no, he wasn't lying. There's this fantastic term that they came up with. It was a way of accepting it was a lie, but he totally just No, it wasn't. It's much. I'll get it in a while, right? No. It's really deep. When the police go deep, they go deep, man. But anyway, they wouldn't accept what the IPCC was saying, and the IPCC, the toothless IPCC, said, "All right, we're going to flag him. That means because we've told you, take him out. We don't want him in these situations. He's not to be trusted. But if you insist on keeping him, we're going to flag him. This means that if he pops up in any investigation, we're going to interview him under oath. Any investigation, we're going to ratchet up the nature of that investigation. Because this is the IPCC saying we know that this bugger's bent. And in this inquest, he's right there. This investigation is right at the heart of it, as you'll see. So why didn't the IPCC hold this investigation? It's what he says here. The senior investigating officer, right? Colin Sparrow, right? And after this, he gets promoted to become the head investigator in the IPCC. The senior investigating officer, the same bastard that I said who went straight to the police at Lehman Street instead of going to the crime scene, this is what happens. He gets the names of all the officers, and then he works out those acronyms, the letters. And this is what the commissioner said he did. He saw the name of this officer, but he didn't give her the name. He gave her the acronym. And he put the name in the safe, and he locked it away. So it's not just the police investigating the police, when it's the Met investigating themselves, they're embedded in the so-called independent institutions that are there to hold them to account. So there was never a thorough investigation by the IPCC. The system, Babylon, corrupt, bent system, unjust system, Babylon system ensures that there's never a thorough, open investigation when the police take somebody's life. So we can't rest in our beds thinking that the police are there to protect us all the time, especially when your face looks like mine. So we're here today on the anniversary of the 10th anniversary of those uprisings that started in Tottenham with our comrades, forensic architecture, rather than being in Tottenham, jumping up and down and shouting at each other. I'm really good on a megaphone. I love a megaphone. But this is the 10th anniversary now, and it's about time that we try to do some things a little bit differently. And there's no point us shouting at people in Tottenham who already believe what we believe because they're part of our experience and part of our history. So what we've come to do is shout at some other people. But we're not going to shout because we don't need to shout because we brought the evidence here. What we're going to ask other people to do is have an open mind, an open heart, and give us some time, give forensic architecture some time, with that open mind and open heart, and listen and share and understand our experience. My name's Stafford Scott. It's been good to be the warm-up act for forensic architecture for you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Stafford. I have to say that for forensic architecture, and maybe I should introduce myself. My name is Eyal Weizmann. I'm a professor at Goldsmiths, University of London, and the director of forensic architecture. I have to say that for us, having worked worldwide in more than 25 countries, this investigation, an investigation of an event that happens so close to home, is perhaps the one that emotionally, that politically is one of the most important for us. I think it's an honor for us to have been invited to investigate this case, initially by the Duggan family and the legal representatives, and later an absolute honor to have worked together with Stafford and Kamara on continuing that investigation and bringing it here to the ICA. I think initially one need to say that we are here in a space that is called the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and I think we are all extremely grateful to the directors and curators and people and staff of the ICA to open a space for us here to debate and present evidence. But this is not the natural place for evidence to be presented in an art space. We are here because we understand that the legal system, that the legal bureaucracy, as in this case, as in so many other cases of police brutality and of institutional racism, are mobilized against racial communities in London, racialized community in London. I think that the fact that the law and the courts, we tend to think of them as kind of neutral spaces that dispense justice and fair judgment, but that fairness did not exist in this case, not a fair weighing of the evidence, and not the kind of mental state to open the hearts and minds of people to look at the evidence. There's one thing is to show scientifically and in images, in words, what is right and what we know, and another is actually to look at them and understand them and to be conditioned to accept those facts. And so we are here because the killing of Mark Duggan, that Stafford rightly called the execution of Mark Duggan, has been called a lawful killing. We're here because we need an alternative forum. We need an alternative space to that of the court. We need an alternative system to that of the law in which we could make our claims. And sometimes when the court does not do, the inquest does not do its job, we need to find an alternative one. So it's an honor, also an honor for me as a Londoner to return to an event that is so deeply engraved in my memory. 10 years after the killing, the unlawful killing of Mark Duggan, 10 years after the event that rocked London and England, I remember August 2011 like it was yesterday. And I know that those events that happened following the killing of Mark Duggan have been based on a certain gap in the history of that city. And the history of that city, the history of London, is not only made of kind of long-term processes. They're not only made and read in the architecture of the city and the kind of bylaws that are being legislated and policies from time to time. History is made in a short duration of time. We're speaking here, and we are 10 years after a gap in the history of London. 2 seconds have passed from the moment Mark Duggan exited the minicab on which he was traveling in Tottenham. From the time he stepped out of the minicab till the time he was shot, 2 or less than 2 seconds have passed. And what happened in those 2 seconds are most important to the history of that city. And the fact that what has happened during those 2 seconds is not accepted. What we know happened in those 2 seconds, that Mark Duggan was shot unarmed by a police officer that thought it is reasonable and his testimony was accepted as honest, to imagine that a gun grows out of the end of an arm of a black person and to shoot that person to death. It's taking us all that time to reconstruct those 2 seconds. But those 2 seconds really are not simply about the biomechanics of movement. They're not simply about the perception, what could and could not be seen. They hold in them, in a kind of a diagram, in a kind of micro dimension, the kind of attitudes and discrimination that are felt by black Londoners, our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues in this struggle. The events that followed the killing of Mark Duggan, had many frequencies in them, as Stafford said. There were protests, there were uprising against racial violence. And simply by calling them riots, we are making ourselves deaf. We don't notice and listen and are not tuned to what was actually said and what was demanded. A break and a change in a status quo of racialized killing. Discrimination has many shapes. There are discrimination in terms of investment, in access, economy, education. And those issues of structural racism erupt sometimes, they exist within those very small molecular dimension of time. So when you will see our investigation, when you will see that it has taken us more than a year to reconstruct those 2 seconds of event, I want you to be tuned to the fact that what is actually existing in those micro movements are refractions and reflection of long-term processes. Forensic architecture as an organization emerged in the context of the anti-colonial struggle in Palestine. This is where our first investigations were undertaken. This is where we still work. This is where I came back to London for this opening from. And we know that there is a history of an entanglement of Black-led liberation struggle and Palestinian liberation struggle. And those two there was enormous lines of solidarity between those two struggles. And often this is something I enormously was motivated, inspired by, but I never fully understood that until we actually investigated the Mark Duggan killing. And seeing how similar it is to Israeli police and military killing Palestinian kids, Palestinian men and women in the West Bank. And not only killing and then creating a whole fog, a whole bureaucratical fog of process in which those killings are justified, are rendered unnaturalized, are seen as something that is actually part of the way things are and should remain. We work on police violence in many countries. We worked on police murders in Turkey, in Greece, in the US, in Germany, of course in Palestine. In each one of those cases, we hear a very similar argument. The police always says and appeals to the same principle of the split second. It was a split-second decision. And the split second, whenever you hear the word split second, you know somebody's dead. It is the most lethal and dangerous of temporal designation. It's a kind of a space of exception, in a sense, a space of exception that exists in time, where murder becomes permitted. Why? Because the split second is always excused as an act of self-defense. Self-defense is something that juries and legal processes tend to accept as an argument by state forces, state security forces, as a legitimate reason for killing. Self-defense and the split-second argument are always about a violence yet to erupt. A split-second decision, police killings mostly are undertaken before or in the expectation of violence to be performed by the person being killed. They are not a response to violence, they are a response to an imagination of violence. They are a response to an expectation of violence. And that expectation is always racially produced. For an Israeli police officer, a Palestinian walking in a majority Jewish neighborhood, or a Jewish neighborhood, because Israel is so segregated in its own apartheid system, a Palestinian walking there is always a ticking bomb, is always a violence yet to happen. They are justified in killing that person to preempt a violence that is imaginary, violence that is imagined based on racial stereotypes. It's never a response to or a punishment for something that has happened. Split-second argument is bringing us into the psychology, into the perceptual psychology of security personnel. And the perceptual psychology of security personnel, even if they claim they act instinctively, i.e., as if a fly, fly towards your eye and you blink or something like that, as if it's a natural response, those instincts are actually culturally produced. They reflect the cultural norms, the perception, the discrimination, the sense in London, and this is something we have learned through our work, and that was the best part of our collaboration here with Tottenham Rights, learning and listening to what they taught us about the history of police brutality here, that when a police encounters a black person, it's always for them a violence yet to erupt. And it is similar to Palestine because the origins of that policing, the origins of the very idea of racial preemption, is something that Adam Elliot-Cooper has mentioned in the book that we are also launching today on the police killing of Mark Duggan. It has its origins in empire, has its origins in colonization, in which violence that is exercised now at present is always a preemption of greater violence, an imaginary violence that would occur if no action is taken. When the jury, as Stafford mentioned, accepted that there was no gun in Mark Duggan's hand, but when they said, even though the officer was justified in imagining that gun into Duggan's hand, and accepted that as an honestly held belief of the police, they equated honesty with racism. The police officer was honestly racist in that respect. So I'm just saying all those things so that when you see the Reconstruction, you do not imagine that what we see is simply a technical work. Within that split-second scenario, we are seeing cultural perception. We're seeing the long history, the long duration of imperial domination, of colonization, of racial relations in London and elsewhere. But the split second was also, as I mentioned before, the most common kind of two words formulation within the interrogation in the inquest of the police officers that witnessed this assassination. They keep on referring to a split second. And they kept on referring to their testimony in videographic terms. And this is something that is very interesting for us because forensic architecture often investigate cases based on videos. This is what we are most known for. There's a bomb, Israeli bombing in occupied Gaza, telephone light up, smartphone light up, and images start being uploaded onto Twitter, onto Facebook, onto YouTube, different places. We collect them, we combine all those perspectives, and we say what happened. In this case, also as Stafford mentioned, there were no cameras. The police officers just started filming when they administered first aid. There is no video recording and no images of that gap in history. This very consequential gap in London history is not captured in images. It's captured only in words. And those words are the words of the police officers. Because Mark Duggan did not survive to give his testimony. So the testimonies of the shooter, V53, and all his comrades that have sat together and coordinated their responses. Mountain of words. Easily, you could see upstairs in our exhibition thousands of pages of words describing those 2 seconds, describing this moment of time, And the way that they describe it, actually, strangely, you read it and you feel that you read a description of a video. They're all talking as if they are recording video through their eyes into the hard drives of their brains. They are talking about panning, they're talking about zooming, and most importantly, they're talking about freeze frames, as if their perception is broken into a series of freeze frames. Now we know that most videos are made of 24 frames a second. There's a great filmmaker called Jean-Luc Godard, who kind of, I think, teasingly said, or let somebody say in one of his films, truth is 24 frames a second. But it's not only the frames that make a film. A film is made of the frames that add up to movement and the gaps, the dark gaps between the frames. And this is where your imagination is actually combining those images into continuity. The officers kept on breaking the event into freeze frames. And somehow, without having videos, our experience in analyzing things based on videos became relevant. Because all of a sudden, the 9 officers that stood closer to the shooting, to Mark Duggan, described 9 different films from 9 different perspectives. But unlike a film, human memory, and in particular, its delivery, the delivery of memory by people who have everything to lose if they are describing things faithfully, it's not the same. So everything that we've done is that we have recreated those films, if you like, shot from the memory of the police officers in order to show they don't add up. We needed to undertake textual analysis, and we needed to investigate what we know of what happened in a scene in relation to the way it was described, to show the gaps, to show the lies, especially of those people whose honesty is rarely questioned by the legal system, and that is the police officer's testimony. Here we go, a map of London, the place in Leighton where the gun was picked up, and the pathway where Mark Duggan minicab is being followed, crossing the reservoirs, entering into Tottenham, and then the place is chosen for the hard stop. In red is the minicab where Mark Duggan is traveling on, followed by police, and that's the hard stop. This is where the question begins. What happened from this moment on? Here is the disposition of the police officers after leaving the car. And this is where the gun was found. And that is the problem. Because if the police officer said, I've seen Mark Duggan holding a gun, he could describe the gun. He could describe the handle. He could describe the sock that was on that gun. Really give a description of a gun. And if he was right, the gun would have been right next to Mark Duggan where he fell. But the gun was not there. It was found 7 meters away behind a sort of a small fence in a kind of sort of an urban green in that location. Oops. How to move on. Chip. Tap. Tap, tap. Here's the minicab. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. You're going to lose faith in forensic architecture, just by the way I'm handling the slides. That's the minicab. The gun has mobilized the entire operation. You heard from Stafford, 3 guns. 1 gun mobilized the chase. The gun in the car is like a magnet. It's what gets the cars to chase. All the police officers are worried about are the gun. Right? They're trying to look if it's been thrown out of the car. When Duggan leaves the car, They all say, or the shooter is saying rather, V53, I had my eyes on the gun. He's seen the gun. He's seen the hand holding the gun, moving forward as if Mark Duggan is about to shoot him. And then that's a split second. Freeze frame, he shoots Mark Duggan. Then, as if in the kind of space between the two frames, in this dark space that I said, you remember film, there's like those gaps, the gun disappears. The gun that mobilized the entire operation all of a sudden disappears and appears only minutes later on the other side of the park. And now I'll pass on to my colleague, Bob, if he can come, to pick up the presentation and actually show you point by point what we've done, how we've done it, etc. Here what you see is, you see it also in the exhibition, is the words, or some of the words, said by police officers, accepted as honest by the inquest. And those words are full of contradictions, impossibilities. And it is out of those words that we slowly build an image. So this is why in the exhibition you would see a big wall in our room. On one side there are the words, and on the other side there are the images.
Well, I just wanted to start by saying thank you very much to the ICA for having us, of course, to all of you for being here. I know it's very hot in here, and this was an event with a start time, but not an end time. I also wanted to say thank you very much to Stafford and to Kamara, to Abby and Rianna for really giving this, what began as quite a narrow technical piece of work that we were completing under the auspices of a legal commission. It feels like with every iteration it's broadened and deepened and been set in a wider and wider and richer context, such that we now really understand so fully how this small grain of technical work stands on this mountain of lived experience and history that Stafford has so well outlined. So I want to take you through some of the technical components of the investigation. I want to spend maybe about 20 minutes doing that, and I want to arrive at a point where we're going to be able to do something which we've never done before in forensic architecture, which is to invite you to share with us a virtual reality experience of the scene that we've been describing so much and that we're going to show you around in the next few minutes. So after I've spoken for about 20 minutes or so, we'll maybe take 15 or 20 minutes where those of you who are quick enough on the draw or booking your tickets in advance can come and have a look at our VR model. We'll then bring it back to the stage. We'll feed back some of that. Perhaps Stafford would like to close us out before we answer some questions. And then Alijan and I will stick around in the VR booth, and as many of you who would like to come and try that out certainly can. So I want to start just by returning to the slide that Eyal almost finished with, to orient us a little bit around this scene, just in case anybody's not sort of fully au fait. So in red here we have Mark's minicab. Surrounding his minicab are 3 of the 4 cars that were involved in the hard stop. From left to right, they are Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie car. The lower leftmost officer you see here is W42. He was the tactical commander for the operation, the second in command overall, and he was also shot by the officer in the lowermost right, V53. V53 fired 2 shots at Mark Duggan. The first passed through his bicep and struck W42. The second passed through his chest and entered into the minicab and was found there. And as we've already touched on, the gun was found 7 meters away. There was not a shred of DNA evidence on that gun that connected it to Mark. And really the investigation thereafter turns on this question of how did the gun get to the grass. So as Eyal's touched on already, the starting point for this investigation was documents. It wasn't videos, which is really our sort of familiar mode of operation at forensic architecture. We had documents, thousands of pages of documents. It was an unfamiliar space for us to work in. The inquest, about which we've already heard so much, put thousands of pages of material into the public domain, including maps, plan views, scene photographs, and also thousands of pages of testimony, transcripts of interviews from the inquest, also witness statements, and expert reports. Some of those we're allowed to show you, and some of those we're not. But first, we had to build the environment, the digital environment within which we could interrogate the claims that were contained within all of those documents. Within all of those transcripts, as Eyal mentioned, we had at least 9 different stories about what had taken place that day. In many respects, those stories were quite similar. In other critical ways, they diverged. In order to begin to extrapolate and tease those stories apart, we needed a digital venue in which to do that. So the first thing that we did was to travel to the scene of the killing in Ferry Lane, Tottenham. We took hundreds of photos. This is one of our team members, Tom James, taking hundreds of photos, covering every part of the area. Using a process called photogrammetry, we then turn those 2D photographs into a 3D model in digital space, which is a very precise reconstruction of the real-world location. We begin then to add additional layers into the model. We place the minicab, the cars, and we use the information from the scene photographs, from the aerial images and maps that were made available to us in order to make sure that those cars are placed precisely within the model. And this became the backdrop for our investigation of the incident, of how and where people moved around the scene. But placing people and movements into the model was much more complicated because we don't, as we've said, have any video footage to rely on. So this layer of the model required us to move back to the documents. So we went back to what the police officers had said on record, examining everything that they'd said on record in their witness statements to the IPCC, which remain the property of the Met and we're not allowed to show you, and in their testimony to the inquest, and also in their handwritten notes, both of which we can show you. Now, Eyal has already shown you this matrix, which is up in the upstairs gallery facing a very different kind of matrix, the gangs matrix, something which grew out of the response to the uprising that followed Mark Duggan's killing. Now, in our matrix, what you have here is our attempt to pick apart the thousands and thousands of pages and words, the many overlapping stories that the officers told. You can read these overlapping and diverging versions from left to right. Once you read left to right, what you're seeing here is 2 seconds, the last 2 seconds of Mark Duggan's life as told by each of the officers. Most of those officers have 2 rows to which to tell 2 stories. The first is the story that they wrote in their initial accounts, and the second is the story that they told to the inquest. Now, of course, there are very interesting points at which those 2 crucially diverge. But reading from top to bottom, this matrix becomes a vehicle by which to closely compare and contrast those accounts, precisely as we've stated our ambition was. In red, you'll see, and you'll have plenty of time to head upstairs and to pick apart this diagram yourself. In red, you'll see where we've identified particularly key contradictions between accounts, where 2 officers appear to have described 2 different events. Now this, of course, given that what we have to rely on here is the police officers' perceptions, and that the nature and the assumptions of honesty about those perceptions are what's at issue here, particularly interesting when those accounts begin to diverge. But what is at least as interesting still is highlighted here in yellow. These are moments that we've referred to as coordination. We might use the word collusion. These are moments at which we've identified the possibility, the suggestion in these testimonies that, in fact, the testimonies do not diverge. They seem to be rather too familiar, rather too similar, rather more similar, perhaps we'd say, than we would expect. And I think it's very important to note that it's not only those moments where testimonies diverge that we see that there might be avenues for further examination, but also where they match up too closely. And I'd invite you to go and take a look at this model in the flesh, this matrix, sorry, in the flesh upstairs. Oh, sorry, excuse me. So something else that I wanted to note about this, this idea of coordination, in fact, before I move on, is that it's something that we've already got to, has already been covered slightly by Stafford, which is to say that on the 4th of August, we know that almost all of the officers who were involved in the shooting that day returned to their headquarters at Lemon Street and wrote their first accounts of the shooting. And they did that in one another's company, and they did that unsupervised. 3 days later, they came back to the same headquarters in Lemon Street, and they did the same thing, and they were unsupervised again. And that means that many of the words that are up on this board were written in tandem. They were written by people sat next to one another, adhering, at least in principle, to the stipulations that they should not confer. But those stipulations are unsupervised and thus largely unenforceable. And I think it's interesting to compare what would happen if any one of us, let's say any two of us, were witness to an act of violence by police. We would be expected to give witness statements, and we would do so in isolation. There would be no chance that we would sit together with no lawyers and no police investigators in order to write those statements together and to confer on what had happened there. And I think it speaks again to this assumption of honesty, which we know is something which is routinely exploited by the actors and through the stories that Stafford has so amply described already. And we see it here too. So another piece of evidence that we had to go on that helped us to begin to pin down precisely where the three critical actors in this story were placed at the critical moment. That's V53, W42, and of course, Mark. We had diagrams that were drawn by the police themselves. We see here W39, we see W70, and V53. Each of these diagrams, you can see on a similar base map, they are describing, drawing out where they believed people had been at certain times. And so as we zoom in on V53's drawing, we see that this is where he believed himself to be approximately. So this is where he claimed in his statement the W42 had been. And we began to repeat this process with all of the officers who made these kind of spatial estimations of where individuals had been at certain times. We combined all the areas that we were able to draw from the plans and the statements. We removed those that were pertaining to moments that were not related to the shooting. We managed to cleave these areas down again slightly by reference to physical constraints, essentially, constraints such as line of sight. And so we begin to arrive at areas which, within which W42 and V53 could have been placed. So at that point, we arrive at our investigative questions. We now have our model, our site model, our model of the urban environment. We have our scene model, our model of the layers of the sort of transient but fixed, in this case, physical objects, the cars, that form the sort of local backdrop to this incident, and we begin to place the actors within that scene. And then we address the two investigative questions that we're going to look at today. So one of them was Mark holding a gun when he was shot, of course. But for us, this investigation is then oriented, or the question of the first question really sort of rides off this second question: how did the gun get to the grass? And we consider that there are three ways that could have happened. So either Mark threw the gun before the period of the shots, Mark threw the gun during the period of the two gunshots, and we can bisect or even trisect that conclusion in certain ways too. Or Mark Duggan left the gun in the minicab and it was moved later by somebody else. So we're going to start, excuse me, got ahead of myself. So we're going to start here with scenario 2. We're going to give scenario 2 most of our attention today because it's the scenario which is most accessible to interrogation by the VR environment that we have to share with you all. Because the IPCC's conclusion leans heavily on the perceptions of V53, something which is taken, as we've seen, as an irreducible piece of factual evidence, something which until now it's been very difficult to comprehensively challenge, as Eyal has outlined. And I think it's worth recalling that what we're trying to do here is not to say definitively what happened in those moments, not least because there's no video evidence of the moment of the shooting, but even in many of our cases where there is, it's not always necessarily possible to come to a precise conclusion about exactly what has happened moment by moment. But what we can do here, and what we have produced the tools to do, is to stress test the claims that have been made about this incident. There have been some very positive assertions, as we've heard, by an inquest jury, by the IPCC, about what did happen there. And what we want to do is test those claims, see which ones are feasible and which ones could not have happened. So the IPCC's report said that Duggan was in the process of throwing a firearm to his right as he was shot. He says that the final location of the firearm is consistent with the movement that V53 said that he saw Mr. Duggan making with his hand. This is precisely the sort of positive factual claim that we're looking to stress test. And we had to do that, or in order to do that, we needed to go deeper into our analysis of the relative locations and body positions of the 3 actors at the heart of this story. So to begin with, we model Mark Duggan's body. We know he was 178 centimeters tall. We know from pathology reports where the locations of the gunshot wounds. So the first shot went through his bicep, his right bicep. It also caused damage to the right-hand side of his chest wall. And the second shot entered through the right-hand side of his chest and entered through the lower left side of his back. And we can draw lines through the we can draw lines through these locations to create shot lines, which begin to tell us something about how the body would have been positioned at the time of each of those shots. And this becomes very important when we consider that the officer involved, V53, makes what we know to be an incorrect claim about the order of the 2 shots, and we're able to disprove that claim by what we see of the position of Mark's body at the time of each of those shots. Now we also, we spent a couple of months probably modeling Mark Duggan's jacket, rigging it, making it animated so that it would move very freely, it would move very fluidly, it would replicate a jacket that you might wear. And we did this because there is an important detail in the damage to Mark's jacket from one of these shots. Now, what's important is here, the lower left pocket of Mark's jacket, and we see that it has 2 holes in it on close inspection. And what that tells us is that at the time of the shooting, at the time of the second shot, Mark's hand must have been pulled up through his jacket and over his chest. Now that again tells us something about the sequence of the shots. And what this gives us is something of a beginning of the movement pattern of Mark through the sequence of this 1.5 seconds in which he leaves the minicab and is shot twice. Now we also had to model the officers either side of Mark, V53 and W42, whose heights we were able to base on their inquest testimony. We included W42's underarm holster, which is important because the bullet that V53 fired hit W42 in his underarm radio, quite remarkably. And so when we know the height of the underarm radio from the height of W42, and we know the height of V53's MP5 machine gun because we know the height of V53, then you can see that these shot lines that we've been able to draw through the gunshot wounds on Mark's body become almost like strings between 2 known points in physical space. And we can begin to arrange Mark, V53 and W42 along those lines, and go into greater detail than ever about the arrangement and sequence of the movements of those individuals during that 1.5 seconds. So by combining all of the information that I've given you there, we were able to arrive at this slow motion reconstruction. I'm going to play it for you in real time afterwards. So we can see that Mark begins with both feet planted on the floor. His left hand would have been in or near his jacket pocket. And his right hand is reached across his waist towards that pocket. Now he begins to move forward with his right foot away from the minicab at approximately an angle of 22 degrees, more or less. His left foot follows. He's struck by the first bullet, which passes through his right bicep, strikes W42 and his underarm radio. His right foot comes across his left as he stumbles. His left arm is up across his chest, and his torso is bending forward at this point, at the time that he is hit by the second bullet, which continues through the door of the open door of the minicab. Now, this is a very slowed down version. I'm going to play it for you again in real time. By our analysis, it would have been between 1.5 and 2 seconds between Mark Duggan exiting the minicab and having been shot for the second time. So now we can use this reconstruction as a venue within which to examine V53's testimony. V53 says, as we've heard quoted already, that he's paying such attention to the gun that he can make out various details of it. I can see the handle of the gun, he says. I can make out the trigger guard. It's side onto his body. He can see the sock that was indeed found over the gun when it was later found. It's worth noting, actually, that only one other officer says that they saw a gun. That was W70. He was stood next to V53. In his initial statements, he does not say that he saw a gun. In his second statement, he does. But he's not able to give any detail whatsoever about the nature of the gun. And indeed, under questioning at the inquest, he's only able to say that it was a gun-shaped object. I think it's very interesting to consider that two officers stood right next to each other should have such differing capacity to perceive what was there. So we know that the gun was found here, around 7 meters from where Mark Duggan was when he was shot. We also know that the gun weighed about 1 kilo, about 1.1 kilo. Now, there's some high school physics we can do there. Right? We know the distance traveled, and we know the weight of the object. And this allowed a biomechanics expert that we worked with, Dr. Jeremy Bauer, to determine the angle and the speed at which the gun would have been thrown. He says that it would have been thrown at an angle between 31 and 40 degrees, and with a minimum speed of 6.7 meters per second. Now, Jeremy Bauer is a biomechanics expert. His real skill here is not in this kind of high school physics, but in the ability to tell us what that throw would have looked like. Oh dear, the GIF was starting. There we go. So Jeremy Bauer was able to tell us that this would be a full body movement. To throw an object of a kilo's weight, 7 meters, with the outside of your arm, this was going to be a throw that reached from your waist high over your shoulder. Now we modeled that. We used motion capture suits to simulate that movement, and then installed that within the model, matching the 31 to 40 degrees throwing angle that Bauer had concluded. So then we come to the next step. We can now ask the question, if Mark Duggan had thrown the gun during that time and we had known what that throw looked like, what would it have looked like from V53's perspective? And is it possible that he could have missed it? V53 says at the time that he was looking directly at the gun. He never took his eyes off the gun until the moment of the second shot, at which point the gun disappears. The gun is then found 8 minutes later, 7 meters away. So here I'm going to show you 4 versions of V53's perspective in those 2 seconds. Again, we're going to slow it down a little bit just so that we have some time to digest. So first we're going to show you what V53 would have seen as Mark exits the car without a gun in his hand. Again, this is slowed down a couple of times, as we've seen. This is about a 2-second period. Now we're going to show you Mark Duggan throwing the gun before he is shot. So at that point, he's throwing the gun. He's probably about 5 meters away from V53. As we saw, this is 6:10 on a sunny August evening. There's very little problem with visibility. Now we're going to show you between the two shots. Here he's probably closer to 4 meters away from V53 at the moment he throws the gun. Now, oh gosh, how do I pause? Quick. Paused? Yeah. I want to pause here because this final scenario, this is the claim that the IPCC stuck to. Of course, they can't say that Mark Duggan threw the gun before the shot. They can't say that he threw the gun even after the first shot, because here in the UK, an armed officer has to justify every single shot that is fired. And so if the IPCC were to say that Duggan had thrown the gun after the first shot, then the second shot would be unjustifiable. So the IPCC has come to the conclusion that is the only conclusion which vindicates V53. And they've done this largely, at least practically, because they've begun with the assumption that V53's testimony could not have been mistaken. So then they've made the pieces fit around this. Oh, nuts. It's all going so well. Somewhere here. Okay. So we see the first shot and the second shot by now around 3 meters away from V53. So 3 meters away, we're talking to that third chair, perhaps, to the fourth chair. A full hip to above your shoulder arm movement. And this is after Mark Duggan has been shot directly through the bicep. It's the claim made by the IPCC. V53 also said that he recognized that it would clear a hell of a lot of stuff up if he was able to say, yes, I saw the gun fly through the air, but, he says, I didn't see it. It's also worth noting, I want to give you 2 more quotes. One is from Dr. Jeremy Bauer. He was commissioned by the lawyers for the Duggan family to produce a report into the possibility of this throw being made. He said it was unlikely that Duggan could have thrown the gun after he was shot in the arm. A second expert, Professor Derek Pounder, who was commissioned by the IPCC originally to do forensic pathology work on this case, said, I cannot conceive, in a second report written in 2019, he said, I cannot conceive of how Mark Duggan could have thrown the gun. And we're going to come back to this, it's quite important, because he said something slightly different when he was asked to investigate this case by the IPCC. And when we tell you where we're at with this case today, that's going to become relevant. Okay, so you can see here how, or you can begin to see at least, how the techniques of our architects and technical researchers are able to combine existing public information with biomechanical and forensic expertise to provide a venue for the synthesis of all that information and evidence, and to give us the clearest understanding to date of what V53 could have seen, to test the claims that he made and that the IPCC has adopted, and the further claims that they've made. But we know, and we have to recognize, that how we see things through human eyes is not equivalent to how things appear on a computer screen. We know this, that the visual field is somewhat flattened on a computer screen. There's nothing quite like the world that you see around you. So where a computer screen flattens a visual field, the eye's visual field is extremely variable. Our central vision tends to be adept at spotting details, while our periphery is better at recognizing movement. So in order to test even more closely the question of whether V53 could have missed the throw that must have been made, must have occurred for his testimony to make sense, we needed to step inside a virtual environment, inside this virtual model that we built, to be surrounded by the digital space in which the reconstruction occurs. So at this point, I'd like us to take another little break, and I'd like to invite anybody that's interested to join us over in the VR booth. We're going to take this in small groups at a time. While this is a modeled environment, we're still depicting the scene of a civilian being killed. And we want to do that in small groups and to give people a modicum of privacy while they're doing that. So we're going to take people in small groups at a time. Alijan and I will also wait around following the conclusion of this talk. So if you don't get a chance now, then you will certainly get a chance later on, and we'd be very happy to answer any questions that we have as we go along, and I'll try and talk you through what you're seeing while you're seeing it too. So yeah, just to give you a couple more signposts, I suppose. Once we've had maybe 20 minutes or so, it's super hot in here. I'm sure people would like to get another drink or maybe go and spend a little time in the exhibition. Then we'll come back here. Perhaps, as I say, perhaps Stafford, you'd like to round up or bring us back together, and then we could have a little Q&A. All right, thank you.
Thanks for coming back. Most of you have come back. Not everyone's back, but we're going to start. This is the panel session. Joining Eyal and I is Jude Lanchin. Jude is a criminal barrister from solicitor from Weizmann and Partners. Jude is here because Marcia Willis-Stewart, the Duggan family solicitor, would be here, but she's had a bereavement, so not really able to join us. So Jude is here to help us, if possible, field any legal questions that may be asked. Dr. Adam Elliot-Cooper is here. Dr. Adam, I was going to say he is an activist and an academic. He strands two different worlds. And he's here to help us further contextualize the experiences that we were talking about of the black community in terms of our experiences of policing, because we don't want people to be under the mistaken impression that bad, racist, discriminatory policing began and ends in Tottenham, because nothing could be further from the truth. So Adam's going to help us contextualize that background history, and then we're going to just field some answers and questions. Try to answer any questions you have, if you do have any questions at all, because I would have hoped that our presentation was pretty comprehensive. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Adam Elliot. Thank you, Adam.
I don't know, is this on? Can you hear me? All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to give a very, very potted history of British policing and racism, and maybe if people want to poke a little deeper or further, we can have a bit of a wider discussion in the UK, a little bit later. But, so I guess it's maybe useful for us to start thinking about British racism at the beginning. And the beginning, of course, of Britain is 1707. It's a relatively arbitrary time. England existed before that. There was kind of colonialism and things like that happening. But I think Britain is a useful place to start, because Britain began not as a nation state, because when Britain was founded in 1707, England already had colonies, Scotland even had a few colonies, and so therefore Britain wasn't really founded as a nation state. It was founded as an imperial state. And so Britain's connection, to put it lightly, with people in Africa, in the Americas and Asia and other parts of the world, is as old as Britain itself. And of course that connection was not benevolent, it was an imperial connection. It was a racist connection. And that history helps us to better understand the ways in which racism is as British as Britain itself. And of course, in order to colonize such huge parts of the world, across Australia, much of the African continents, much of South Asia, and a lot of North America and the Caribbean, and Ireland, of course, and other parts, and the Middle East, and I could keep on going, parts of the Pacific, etc. An ideology, a mode of governance, a system of control was necessary. And the reason this system of control was necessary was because Britain, like other European countries, was faced with a really fundamental contradiction. On the one hand, you had all of the principles that Britain represents: democracy, the rule of law, justice, the kind of freedoms and liberties and ideas that we associate with modern democracy today, what they would have called back then, or what we now call the Enlightenment, right? These principles of individual liberty, the rule of law and justice. But on the other hand, you have what Britain is actually doing throughout the world, becoming the largest slave trading nation in human history, exterminating the indigenous peoples of Australasia and parts of the Americas, taking the lands and freedoms of people across the African continents and parts of Asia and Ireland and elsewhere. And the way in which this contradiction is reconciled, right, between everything Britain tells the world and itself that it represents, these Enlightenment ideas, and the actual tangible reality of what Britain is doing around the world, the way in which that contradiction is reconciled is through race. It's race that enables Britain to simultaneously be the moral leader of the world, representing these enlightened ideas, while at the same time being the largest slave trading nation in human history, exterminating indigenous peoples across the world and taking the lands and freedoms of resources of people all over the planet as well. But the other thing that's really sophisticated, of course, about this system of imperialism isn't simply what it's doing kind of ideologically or conceptually, right? This is really crucial. What's really important about what it's doing is what it's doing militarily, physically, in terms of its policing. Because in order to control such a large section of the world's population, Britain had to develop a really sophisticated system of policing. And I think we see the kind of apex, the kind of crescendo of this really sophisticated form of policing in the early to mid 20th century, when you see the real rise of anti-colonial movements in islands across the Caribbean, in the island of Ireland, across Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And it's here that you see Britain begin to develop what it calls counter-insurgency policing. And it's this counterinsurgency policing in which Britain begins to do a number of key things. The first thing it does when it sees that there's an anti-colonial movement is it identifies a suspect community, an area within the colonised population that it can identify with being the troublemakers, the dissidents, the criminals. In Trinidad and Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, these were generally the trade unionists, the workers who were going on strikes, which led to mass uprisings in the 1920s and 30s in the Caribbean. In parts of British colonial Kenya, it was the Kikuyu people who the British called the Mau Mau and referred to them as terrorists. In Malaya, it was the Chinese Malay, who they referred to as communist terrorists. In other parts, in Rhodesia, the indigenous people of Rhodesia were referred to as terror gangs. And Britain engaged in what they referred to as anti-gangs policing across both Rhodesia and Kenya in the 1950s and 60s. And I think it's interesting that they were referring to African people as gangs when they're engaging in anti-colonial struggles during these decades, because of course this is the kind of racial language we see migrating to the British mainland as significant numbers of black people begin to migrate to Britain in the post-war period. And so in the 1960s and 70s, as we begin to see more and more people migrating to Britain, we also see these anti-colonial movements being repressed. And so first, these suspect communities are identified. Next, we see quite militarized forms of policing being used, checkpoints, searches, people being moved into so-called containment villages, which are effectively prison camps for a lot of people. And we see people being incarcerated, killed, and protesters being shot at. But I think what's really crucial is how that colonial policing comes home. And that colonial policing begins to come home to the British mainland here today through a number of really interesting processes. Of course, racism really comes home to Britain with a vengeance as people from Africa and Asia and the Caribbean migrate to Britain in significant numbers in the post-war period. But what also happens at this time is that colonial policing comes home with them as well. And the way in which we see that happen is interestingly through Ireland. Because in the 1970s and 80s, we see an anti-colonial movement in Ireland begin to bring that kind of colonial policing far closer to Britain. It comes to what we now call, I guess we might call the United Kingdom. And it's through that we begin to see these kinds of colonial tactics, things like CS spray and tear gas, things like using other kind of militarized equipment that we don't generally associate with civilian policing here in this country, being used against civilian populations, right? Something that was the norm in Britain's colonies, but never on the UK mainland, apart from in Northern Ireland. And we see those kinds of tactics coming to the British mainland outside of Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 80s, following the moral panics around the black muggers. And we really, and I think it comes in 2 or 3 key ways. One of the ways in which we see it is through the police officers themselves. People like Kenneth Newman, whose delightful quote you see at the start of this exhibition, who cut his teeth as a police officer first in British Mandate Palestine and then in Northern Ireland, winning his knighthood for handing over power from the British military to what's now called the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And he's brought into police London following the uprisings of 1981 because of his experience of dealing with dissident colonial subjects in places like Palestine and Ireland. But what we also see in 1981, which is really crucial in the early 1980s, is the use of colonial tactics in places like Toxteth and Moss Side, as well as Brixton for the first time, to repress the urban uprisings of that year. So we see tear gas and CS spray used on the British mainland for the first time in Toxteth and Moss Side in 1981. We see the colonial tactic of driving an armoured vehicle into a crowd of people, purportedly with the expectation of dispersing them for the first time in Liverpool and Manchester in 1981 as well, and with one young disabled man being killed in that process. We see the tactics, of course, of identifying suspect communities in order to justify these kinds of tactics. The suspect communities, of course, generally being young black men. And it's following this that we then see by 1985 in Broadwater Farm, as Stafford has also talked about a great deal, Kenneth Newman bringing officers with rubber bullets to the scene of Broadwater Farm. And although the rubber bullets were not deployed, this was the first time rubber bullets had been taken to a scene of civil unrest on the British mainland ever. And so we see what's really crucial, I think, about this history of racism and policing is that it's fundamentally linked to the British Empire. And it's far older than 1981. It's far older than the Windrush. And it is as old as Britain itself. And so when we think about these histories of racism and resistance to it, I think it's really important that we don't allow it to be confined to the British mainland or be confined to the post-war period. And it's these international struggles against racism that I think that this exhibition is a really important part of. And I think that taking that historical as well as global context, I think is really crucial in understanding both the racism that's being faced and how it can be overcome. I'll leave it there.
Now we want to make this a bit more interactive, open up the floor and invite you all to ask any questions if you have any questions, if you want to follow your curiosity. The floor is yours.
Hiya. That's really interesting to hear your thesis around the colonialism behind the policing. I'm Northern Irish, ended up in Tottenham 20 years ago, and here I am today. It's a question for Judith, really. Hearing what we've heard, or seeing what we've seen, and knowing what many people in the community know, thinking about other inquests that were whitewashes over the years. I think of Ballymurphy, Bloody Sunday, stuff that Bernberg Pierce has worked on for years in terms of Hillsborough. What is the path to getting another inquest? Is it something like new evidence? That's highly unlikely. You know, that's my question. Where do we go from here?
Okay. Yeah. Can I just clarify that I'm not an inquest lawyer, so my answers are going to be quite generalistic. But what I would like to do is actually refer firstly to Eyal to explain what has happened in the last legal process that we've had with regard to the Crown Prosecution Service and the material, or the IOPC, I should say, and the material that has been submitted to them, which is all of this, and their refusal to reopen any kind of process at all on the basis of this quite extraordinary material that has, and the whole investigative process that forensic architecture have gone through, which has never been put before any body of any sort in relation to Mark. So I'd like Eyal to be able to explain what the basis of the rejection of all of this is first.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about that. So maybe I'd say that, or I'd say again, that the first stage of our investigation was actually working with Marcia and with Raju towards a civil suit, civil claim. And it has arrived at an arbitration stage when each side show the evidence that they have and they intend to actually present in court. Having seen the evidence, the lawyers, the Met lawyers, actually advised the Met to settle rather than get the material to be presented in an open court. The Met has paid a sum of money that we do not know exactly what it is because of the confidentiality agreement, or part of the settlement is a confidentiality clause. The minute that has arrived, that decision, that settlement has arrived, the minute, I would say really, literally a week or two later, we met with Stafford, who came to our office, and we decided to actually pursue a two-pronged strategy. One, and that was what was important to Stafford and also us, present, because the material hasn't been presented, the material that was prepared for the civil suit was not presented. Stafford was rightly saying it needs to be first shown to the community and the family. And we've done that in Tottenham. Following that, we worked again together with the advice of the legal team, but also with Tottenham Rights, on formulating a request to the IOPC, the body that replaced the IPCC that so incompetently mishandled this investigation, asking them to reopen the investigation. Now, in order to reopen the investigation, the test that you have to pass is to show that there is new evidence. Now, what exactly is new evidence? It could be quite ambiguous. Obviously, if you find, you can find DNA that was not found before. You find a new object. There's new photography of the event. That is obviously new evidence. The kind of evidence that forensic architecture produce is synthetic in the sense that if you think about it like that, in a court case, every expert present a different type of evidence, a different bit of evidence. And you have, and listening to courts is like listening to a kind of a fragmented reality. Testimony of one person. Then you interrogate the DNA specialist and the biomechanic and the pathologist, etc. You get the story from all those things. The reality is that verification exists in putting those evidence in relation to each other. And that's what forensic architecture was able to do. This is what we always do. Every time we investigate, we are faced with a bigger evidence pile. You know, if at the beginning when we were formed 10 years ago, around an incident of police brutality or, you know, chemical strike in Syria or an Israeli military action, you'd have a couple of videos, maybe a dozen videos. Today, when we investigate cases, we are often faced with thousands of hours of videos. And effectively, what we do is look at the relation between things. There's no point simply looking at each one in isolation. So firstly, our claim was there's a new ability based on new technology and based on a new inclination to synthesize the existing evidence and to examine them in relation to each other. But we did need also a new data point, if you like, a single new data point. And that new data point came from Jeremy Bauer, who is an expert that was not actually consulted during the inquest, was actually commissioned by Marcia and Raju at the time. And he's been able to actually examine the bodily movement, the muscles. Would it be possible to throw? What kind of movement would be necessary? And we thought that's absolutely crucial because what we needed to show is that the honest, you know, the kind of the honesty of the killer cup, V53, need also to be reasonable. That you would say, well, you know, if honesty does not actually, if the kind of testimony of a police officer does not need to kind of come in contact with reality, it's hallucination, basically. So you need to be able to show that what a police officer has imagined was reasonable to be imagined. Okay, so all the investigation is hinging on that, the difference between, you know, whether the police officer really thought he saw, or two, whether the police officer was reasonable in believing what he has believed. And that was a new data point. That was kind of like a foot in the door. That should have done the job. So when we sent a letter to the IPCC, they've taken a lot of time, and we were spending hours discussing it with Stafford and others. What does it mean, that delay? And in fact, we didn't know that it went to a stage of internal review at the IOPC, where they have actually, so usually you know, they can dismiss it offhand, but they haven't. They've gone through a process, and they actually sent us some kind of 20, 30 pages response to that, trying to wriggle themselves out of that being new evidence, trying to claim falsely, erroneously, and manipulatively that they have examined that fact. We saw no evidence that they have. They've actually also misrepresented the nature of the commissioning of this expert, Jeremy Bauer, by saying he was asked to do something else. The whole thing seems like it was written by an inexperienced, you know, sort of like not even sort of a professional investigator. It was shocking, and the kind of the level, you know, you're facing with those state institutions. Kind of your assumption is at least that they would know their own. You know, they make the game and they would play the game. But even in their own game, they were tripping over the words and unable to do that. So it just showed a mediocre, incompetent organization, unwilling to take, scared of its own shadow, scared of the implications. And indeed, there would have been implication if they would say, we are reinvestigating. The implication would be massive, I think, politically, obviously to the family, to the Duggan family. And just the level of work was atrocious. So we responded to we answered the reason that they said that it kind of failed to qualify as new evidence after examining, after the first process. I don't believe that we'll have a reopening of the case. I think it's here. It's on another level. It's on a political, cultural level. It's on the level of the exhibition, of the curatorial work that Kamara and Stafford has made, that we're going to debate that now.
And did you have a response to your challenge to their letter? Have you had a response to that?
No, they haven't answered that.
Okay. From what I can say, and there may be civil lawyers here, but the only next step, I believe, would be to consider a judicial review of the IOPC decision. And I believe that is potentially being looked at by the lawyers who do represent the family. However, because there have been certain events in the personal life of, in fact, both lawyers, that there has been a delay in that. From the little bit that I know, I think it's going to be very difficult because you have to show for a judicial review that it's a completely unreasonable decision and that no reasonable body would have reached that conclusion. However, I believe that it should be done. That even though none of us believe in the legal process, we've got to keep fighting. We have to. And if you're launching a legal attack, if you like, that you don't feel fully confident in will win legally, that in and of itself assists you to generate more publicity, can go hand in hand with the exhibition and keep the debate alive. And I just think it's absolutely crucial, particularly because of the nature of the new evidence. This has not been used before in any British case, as far as I'm aware. That's correct, isn't it? Whether a criminal case or a civil case of any sort. And I think it's amazing that this relationship has begun, and it's something as a criminal defence lawyer that I'm also very interested in to potentially look at for the future.
From my perspective, what I would say is we speak about the system, Babylonian system, and this notion that the police are the only ones should have that monopoly to investigate the police when the police are being involved in criminality. And that's what they're doing. They're trying here not to set precedent that would mean that, we're starting to open the door to other agents truly independent, using technology in a proper and appropriate way. And that's what the system doesn't want us to do. And what Eyal didn't say in all of that is that even when we went to the IOPC, we were actually asking decision makers. So one of the things they said when they closed down the IPCC was that when we open the IOPC, we're going to have less police officers as investigators. But they still kept the lead officer who was ex-police. But then most of the policy makers, the senior management team that was part of the IPCC, they kept. So when we went to them and asked them to reverse the decision and reopen the investigation, we're asking some of the very people who I believe corruptly ensured that this investigation had the outcome they did, because the IPCC corruptly used public money, and they told every expert that they commissioned that they should only consider gun in Duggan's hand, that they shouldn't consider the gun being thrown before, they shouldn't consider the gun being in the car, and they shouldn't consider the gun being planted. And these are the same people who we've now gone back and asking them to reverse their decisions. So again, it's that notion of getting people to mark their own homework. If you look at the first banner that we have out there, where it depicts war in the Babylon, you'll see a community struggle for, and we cross out the word justice, because they control the justice system. We're not about looking for justice. There is no justice. There's just us. So we're about sharing what we know to be our truths and rights with as many people as we can, so that justice becomes even more. Because ultimately, that's what we need. we need to win over the court of public opinion. And then we need to put as much pressure on the system as we possibly can to get the system to change.
Can I just add one other thing legally about how amazing it is to be involved with forensic architecture, is that there has always been, as everyone knows, an inequality between whether you're in an inquest and it's the family side against the state, whether you're in a criminal trial and it's the defense against the prosecution, that this goes some way to slightly rebalancing that because of the level of expertise and technology that they employ, and the kind of creativity, hopefully, that lawyers can use in different processes, legal processes, for the search for truth and rights, and maybe sometimes in individual situations, justice. So it's really, really significant, really significant.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. Hi, I'm Marcia, and I'd first of all like to say that this presentation of the evidence is absolutely phenomenal. My brother died in police custody. My brother was Sean Rigg. And I went through the evidence in my brother's case and my brother's meticulously in this manner. So I'm just going to try to shorten it, because my question is, I believe I've got new evidence in my case that was shown at the end, at a misconduct hearing, which we'd never seen before. It's never been tested in court. I'd really like to do something like this in my particular brother's case. I have all the CCTV evidence and witness statements. We had a perjury trial. We had a public hearing. We had lots of different things, but something new came out. And I understand what Stafford and you've all said about getting the case reopened, because that's what I would like in my case. You know, when we had the inquest, we did have the case reopened and it became a criminal case. But in the end, the CPS said there was insufficient evidence for a realistic prosecution, a conviction. But there's ample evidence. And one of the evidence was this. So the officers claimed that in the back of the van being transported to the police station, that Sean was upside down on his back, bare-chested, handcuffed to the rear, with his feet in the air, walking 360 degrees in a very small area in the van, in the footwell. Impossible. The IPCC, years later, they did a reconstruction like this of a 3D model. They said that they had an expert. You know, I thought there's no way we can lose. And there was a 3D to show that, you know, how he could have moved and the positions he would have been able to move, but not in the position that was said. Almost 11 years later, in a misconduct hearing, suddenly one of the officers brought new evidence on his mobile phone that we'd never seen. He was the officer that said he saw Sean doing this. There's no CCTV. There's only the accounts of the officers. The IPCC's conclusion was that the officers adhered to policy during the transportation to the station, which was this. But 11 years later, an officer produced his own mobile phone footage of him depicting what he said Sean was doing. And it was the complete opposite. Mm-hmm. You know, he was in a stationary vehicle and so forth. Anyway, it was thrown out of the misconduct hearing because they said that the pathologist had become unwell and could not give evidence, because the officers were arguing that they... I know, sorry. What I'm asking is, with this new evidence that's never been tested in court, would it be something that I could use in my case to reopen the investigation again?
Marcia, I think that's obviously something you can have a really detailed discussion with Eyal about. Can I just also say, just listening to you, that the other huge impact of potentially of your work is this whole issue that the blimmin' CPS will never charge anybody. And so, again, potentially with lawyers having the advantage in some cases of not just new evidence, but perhaps just material that and work the forensic architecture has done, it may be able to be used by civil lawyers who are pushing the CPS to bring charges, because as we all know, they all hide behind the what is called the code for Crown prosecutors, and that is the code that states that there has to be a so-called realistic prospect of conviction, and that is always what they use to say that in their view the evidence doesn't stack up enough for them to prosecute. And yes, of course, we know that they prosecute all sorts of other people in ordinary criminal cases where there could be doubts, and so potentially, again, forensic architecture could help with that side of things.
Thank you, Jude.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia, for raising this issue. I mean, to me, it seems that if a new video emerges, that really falls neatly into a kind of a new evidence. And there should be a realistic chance to do work. I'm not sure this is within our competence. I'd be very happy to look at it with you, perhaps with Stafford also together, who has experience in those matters. I think that what we need to do, what is really important to do, is that work like ours does not become, kind of like the exclusive, sort of property of forensic architecture, something that, only we could do, but that we are able to train people, that we are able to build capacity. And we've had some discussion, Stafford, about how to do that and how to move from the, and imagine if I make just a kind of a very, kind of like two-stage sort of process. I know it could be very diagrammatic. In the early 2000s, video started emerging. The whole debate changed with videos. We know that videos could be biased. You know that, in the way you frame, in the way you edit, in the way that even the camera distorts. You don't have it. Video is not the truth, quote unquote. But it changed the contours of the debate. Now we have many videos, and simply to look at videos is not enough. You need to create a synthesis. Those synthesis is made through and in 3D environments. And I think that basic capacity to do that need to be the property and need to be available to every community that is persecuted, that's exposed to this is the next step. I was just speaking to Stafford. It was like, and Kamara, and it's been so difficult to build a show during COVID time, even though it was a year and a half postponed. It taken definitely all of Stafford and Kamara's time doing that. We are now, this is open, and we need to think ahead. And we need to think perhaps with the monitoring group, with other groups here, how do we build capacity? How do we actually make sure that people have access to that technology? It does not need to queue up to forensic architecture, because right now, there's a limit to the actual cases that we could take. But what there is no limit is for ideas and technologies, because these could be shared. And there's enough talent, and there's enough know-how, and there's enough images within Tottenham and in other places that are resisting police violence. And I think that this is really the next step that we need to do. We need to have people interning, working with us in our offices, and learning, and then taking it on and doing better.
I think that's a fantastic idea, especially because so many people are interested in technology, mobiles, phones. It's just
the young generation. They just look at it. They know immediately how to do it.
I think that's a really great idea.
Hi, just following on from that, I was wondering, probably maybe Stafford, but others as well, if you think that the onset of technology and people recording stuff on their phones, as well as the fact that police are supposed to often wear body-worn cameras, has had any impact on racist policing or police in general?
Gosh. Well, the wearing of body-worn cameras by police officers, certainly that's a victory for us, because we've campaigned and demanded that. And I think we know of some cases where they've had to release the body-worn video footage, and we've then been able to use that footage to try to hold them to account. So again, it is a start, but as usual, it's Babylonian system, which means that they're in control. They're in control of when the camera gets turned off, when it turned on, when it gets turned off, and they're in control if they sanction them severely enough when they abuse the technology. But the technology is there, and it can definitely be a tool and a power for the good moving forward.
I'd just say as well with criminal cases that their arrogance knows no bounds, because the amount of criminal cases that I've still got where you look at the body worn, and I mean even the one that we were talking about, but other cases where you look at it and you just think, well, this doesn't add up, this doesn't support your evidence for the criminal case, or that there are contradictions between this footage and what some of the police might be saying, but they're still prosecuting people. They're still prosecuting people, and the particular case that Stafford was talking about, which I won't go into, but I have written to the CPS and said, how can you possibly be suggesting that this marries up with this? Isn't this going to call into question, whether there's a realistic prospect of conviction? And they must be looking at something different to me, because I just don't understand the response from them. But anyway, it does get tested in the criminal court, and sometimes it wins, but we win. But Stafford's right, sometimes they're not turned on, or there's only a couple of officers who've got them on during an incident, which is the one that Stafford's referring to, and so you only get a partial view of what's happened. So it is a good thing, but it's not the be-all and end-all of changing how policing's happening or prosecutions at all.
Yeah, I guess one way to say is that it's necessary but not enough. And people tend to think of videos like the kind of absolute evidence, like whatever is caught on film is it. But there's a lot of interpretive work that needs to be done, and there's a lot of things that are left outside of the frame or slip between frames, or with body cams. I remember in the discussion you organized in Tottenham, it was really one of the people that came up said, and I think it's kind of a trope to say that also, that police-worn body cams are oriented the wrong way, right? They're kind of, by the nature of them, they're kind of trained on the person and turn somebody into kind of a suspect. You're not looking at what the police is doing, although sometimes you can see some hands and guns kind of entering into it. But it's another mode of criminalizing the person that is being chased, the person is being brutalized, the person is being murdered by the police. And something that is called perspectival bias has already been understood by people resisting police brutality in the US. And it means perspectival bias is when you're looking at body-worn camera, you tend to adopt the point of view of a police officer. So you know that kind of from ego shooter games, sort of single-person shooter. So we are conditioned to kind of accept that point of view as the point of view of the good, right? And that has a problem. Another problem that was identified with body-worn cameras is because part of the nature, they have to have very wide-angle lenses because they need to capture a lot of space. And what a wide-angle lens does is that it aggravates kind of, let's say, a kind of a casual interaction. If you look at anything on body-worn cameras, because your hand, if I just say hi, right? In a body-worn camera, the hand has to pass through so much lens space, if you say, it becomes much more aggressive looking. And it kind of creates a phenomena that, people looking at that, feeling that the situation that they've been looked at is much more aggressive than it was. This is all to say that every piece of evidence, whether it's text, whether it's image, whether it's memory, it needs to be processed, has to be read, we need to know how to look at it. We need to know how to ask the right questions. We need to know how to combine it with other pieces of evidence. Evidence is never, and forensics, the proof is never just lying on the ground to be picked up. There's always a labor, an interpretive labor that needs to be done. And that is something that I think we always need to be skeptical to anything that we are shown or seen. Maybe you want to add something to that. I don't know if you want to.
And I just wanted to. Sorry, can I just add something really quick?
Right, I'm sorry because we're kind of going over time. Okay. I'm going to take. I know Diane's got a hand up. We'll take that last question if that's all right.
I didn't know we had time. I thought it's.
No, but we've got time that we need people to be back for. So
okay,
we've gone way over
that.
now.
Sorry.
I just want to ask a question. Given the contextual evidence and the visual evidence that forensic architecture has presented, which I think is excellent, and that the law had changed where a person could be tried twice for the same crime, how is it that the police, this case cannot be reopened, or the police, cannot face the judiciary?
But double jeopardy is within the criminal process.
But isn't this a criminal act? Isn't killing, isn't that a criminal act? Or am I getting this wrong?
Well, we're not, the Crown Prosecution Service, who would be the ones to decide on whether V53 should be charged, have never been asked to consider that because the verdict in the inquest was lawful killing. And so it's not even in the picture.
Which is why we took the route of trying to get the IOPC to reopen the investigation. So ultimately, you may come up with that.
So we're not even there.
Thank you for that clarity.
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to let the discussion go on for longer, but we have a film that's going to be shown at 8 o'clock called The Hard Stop, which is a continuation of this story in its own way. We feel that people might need to want to get water and fed. We're going to do a little walkthrough, and that generally takes around 2 hours. So I think that, it's an appropriate, it can take more hours depending on how much detail you want. I think that might be an appropriate place for us to end this session. I want to say thank you to all the panel members. Adam, I think that you just came in and you just done a really brilliant ad hoc piece of history and contextualization there for us. That was really appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
And thanks for participating.
Maybe we should mention Adam's book, Black Resistance to Police.
Black Resistance to British Policing.
To British Policing is available in the best bookshops, except for the very best, which is here, which we're going to amend soon.
Absolutely.
Thank
Adam,
you. Thank you.
Thanks for everything.
Thanks, everyone.
Eyal, amazing as ever. Your stuff. You're a pioneer in this. Thank you for, and the rest of the forensic architecture team for taking the time to share, present the model with us. That's a premiere. That's the first time it's being shown in public. I hope people really appreciate how significant, not just the event, but the actual model and the work the forensic architecture do in this context is. So big hands for Eyal. And Jude, thank you for sitting in when we needed to ensure that we had some legal advice. And if anyone's going to get sued after this session, we're going to try and make sure it's you. Thank you for everything. And thank you for all for spending so long. It's been pretty detailed and emotional for some of us. I want to thank you all for taking that time. This is really the first week in our public program, and the public program has been developed and devised. We hope that it deepens and extends the reach of the exhibition outside. I'm going to do a walk around with some people, hopefully, well, with people who hopefully haven't already done the walkthrough. Again, may give a different perspective and understanding of what we've got out there. You'll see the rest of the public program. It'll come up on the ICA websites next week. It'll be running from the week after and going throughout September until we finish here on the 26th. I want to thank you all for your patience and your involvement. Hope you enjoyed it and hope we see you back for some of the other sessions. Thank you all.